So, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks ever so much for joining us on our webinar this afternoon, which is how to prepare your business for public sector tendering and a little bit of support on Commonwealth Games 2022 procurement. And this is a follow-up of the seminar that we had on Friday. But if you weren't able to attend that, then that has been uploaded now to our YouTube channel through Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. My name's Mandy Haig. I'm the International Director, and I'm also responsible for the Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce. So today we've got a webinar which is going to last approximately 45 minutes. And we've got James Sharp from University of Birmingham that's going to be running us through the webinar. We're going to be going through the question and answer session at the end. So if you can, think of any questions that you want to ask. If you put them in the chat box during the session, and then I will do my best to collate those with James at the end, and we'll get through as many as we can. If we do find that there's quite a lot of questions, though, then we will look at answering those after the event for you. I just wanted to bring in a little bit first about some of the support that we've got going on at the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, just in case you hadn't had opportunity to see that. With the current situation going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, back at base, we've certainly been really busy in ensuring that we are supporting businesses as much as possible. So you can see here on this slide, and we will share the slides afterwards, so please don't feel that you've got to take lots of notes today, because they will be there for you. But you can see there are lots of links available. We have lots going on social media with the Chamber Chat and our member-to-member offers. So if you are a member, please do have a look at that. And if you're not a member and you want to be, then please get in touch. We've got a fantastic coronavirus hub, and our team in policy have been working really hard to make sure that all the information is there for you. It's all in one place. We're updating the coronavirus grid, sometimes on a daily basis when information is coming back through from government. And we've got a great report on there as well, which is called Mind the Gap. And this has been really well received by the business community. So what we've done is we've reached out to find out what support is still required for businesses, and then we are lobbying on business behalf to do that. We've also got the daily e-news. Now, even since this slide was brought together, and that was very recently, the daily e-news subscribers have gone up to over 16,000. So it really is a great source of information, and our team in PR work really hard to make sure that the stories that are coming through are really relevant and current. So just whilst you're here, and the fact that you're here means you're really interested in our events at the Chamber, here are a few more webinars that you might be interested in taking a look at. We've got tomorrow, we're running a couple actually, one on education, a further education, and the second one is more of a transatlantic theme. Certainly with the second one, the speaker that we have, Alison Stewart-Allen, I have attended her events in the past, and she's very inspirational. Then we have on Wednesday the 27th about how the charity sector is responding to the crisis, which is certainly a key webinar to attend if you are within that sector. It's very close to a lot of our hearts to make sure that we are supporting that sector as much as possible in the current situation. And then on the 28th of May as well, we've got another one. I like the fact that a lot of them are at lunchtime, which is good. What does it take to get into the corporate supply chains? Another key one off the back of this, really, to understand, you know, how businesses that may feel that they're quite small in comparison to the big tier ones, how they can get involved and get into those supply chains. So this is really relevant after this session. 29th of May, we've got the Armed Forces Covenant and an introduction to that. So again, one to certainly tune into. And then the Global Trade Conference. So we've just launched that at the Chamber. It's part of a week of international themed events. And it's been really well received so far. We've got lots of interesting sessions, and we have some confirmed speakers, which are really exciting. And you will see more going on with that next week as we start to promote it. But if you want to get involved, you can find all of the information on the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce website and just drop onto the events tab there. So without further ado, you're here to listen to James Sharp from the University of Birmingham Business Engagement Team, and he works to support his academic colleagues to capture research funding. And I know James is going to give his own introduction. So over to you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mandy. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thanks everyone for joining us here today. Hope you're all doing well at the moment. And in particular, thanks to the Chambers of Commerce for having us here, and to Mandy and Grace for all their help in getting this set up behind the scenes. So yeah, my details are there on the front, and I'll flash those up again at the end. But if anyone has any questions that we don't get around to today, then by all means drop me an email and I'm happy to continue the conversation afterwards. So just to give you a quick agenda then for what we're going to talk about, I'll give a little bit about us at the University of Birmingham and our experience in tendering and so on. We'll go through some considerations for a competitive tender. And we'll look at a University of Birmingham case study, some of the lessons learned that we had there before going on to a Q&A at the end. So starting off then, a little bit about us. Some stats there. I'm based, as Mandy said, in the university's business engagement team. We're part of a university-wide professional services group. We provide specialist support for competitive tendering and research-related activity at the university. And I myself have over 10 years experience in public sector tendering across the private sector, third sector and higher education. So the university is research intensive. Last year, we submitted over 2,000 bids across the university, and we secured over £215 million in awards. And also as part of our civic engagement mission, we work extensively with industry and government to support regional socio-economic growth, which is really important to public sector tendering generally, but also the Commonwealth Games, which we'll touch on as well. In terms of industry, we're the preferred supplier to major commercial frameworks commissioned by Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, P&G, and people like that as well. So just to give you some ideas of our credentials. I'm really pleased to bring our expertise to you today and to share our insights into the process of developing a competitive bid. The fundamentals that I'll talk about are going to be broadly applicable across just about any public sector tendering opportunity. Although I appreciate the Commonwealth Games is generating a lot of excitement at the moment, so we'll focus on some of the specific aspects that we've seen in some of those tenders over the last few months. And also I appreciate that a lot of this may be familiar to some of you who've had any significant tendering experience, but hopefully there'll be some new information in there and we'll start to generate some really good discussion off the back of it. So first of all, then starting off with some of the basics, and these are kind of the most obvious parts of a tender, but also we often see them to be some of the most overlooked elements of a bid. So always, the first thing to do is to read the guidance from cover to cover, and it sounds really obvious, but it is often you'll find that you've got a lot of information across a lot of different documents. And so doing some kind of document preparation at the beginning is really, really important. Some of the key things to look out for through that guidance are, first of all, the eligibility criteria. Sometimes a tendering organisation will be looking for specific types of organisations that they want to apply. So check your eligibility is the first thing, because you may not be even eligible to apply, and you don't want to put in that work if you don't have to. I've already mentioned that those multiple documents as well, but make sure when you're looking at those, you identify everything across there that is being asked for. One of the things that I often do is to condense all of the documents into a checklist, which has all of the must-haves and the should-have sections of that tender invitation document. And sometimes it's as easy as if you've got a PDF of that or a Word document, doing a Control F, a Control Find, and typing in things like must, mandatory, should, and seeing what comes up in there. Make sure you focus on the evaluation criteria. Obviously, across all of those different documents, there will be some clear weighting which is applied, and that's important to bear in mind. And also familiarize yourself with the process and the portal that you're going to be expected to go through. Sometimes there can be signing up requirements, and they can take longer than a few minutes in terms of gathering the information that you need to provide. So once you've got those fundamentals under your belt, it's often a really good idea to look out for funder-run events. Often public sector will do this, where they'll hold an event or a webinar where they'll give some additional insight and give you the opportunity to query some of those elements with the funder directly. Thirdly, remember the bigger picture, which is being applied to the opportunity. So often public sector tenders, particularly large opportunities, will be split into multiple lots, or kind of tenders within their own right, tenders within a tender almost. And it's easy to get sucked into just focusing on what they're specifically asking for as a deliverable from that lot. But actually, it's really important to remember that bigger picture. And so we saw this with the Commonwealth Games recently. They had overarching considerations which needed to be addressed, as well as the specifics within those lots. And I'll touch on a few of those a little bit later. And it's a good idea to look at the delivery of previous similar programs. Often tendering with public sector can be very secular. And Commonwealth Games is a great example of this, looking at the Glasgow Commonwealth Games, especially considering there are members of the Glasgow organising committee on the Birmingham organising committee and their board. But at the same time, don't assume that the approach will work the second time around. You need to take into account those regional considerations. And then finally, don't hesitate to ask questions, especially if there's any ambiguity in those tender documents. It's often the case there can be things which are unclear or contradictory. It's just the nature of the beast. So look to query that ambiguity whenever you can. So moving on, we're going to have a quick run through then of one of the other fundamental aspects, which is the approach, or ultimately the structure that you'll apply to your team when you're addressing this tender requirement. So these are some of the more common approaches that tend to be seen in public sector tenders, and often they'll stipulate what type of team they're looking for and setup they're looking for. The three that are here were actually used in the most recent Commonwealth Games tender that I took part in. So you usually have a choice as to how you structure a multi-organizational partnership, which is often necessary. You can bid as a single entity, although the complexity will often mean that a partnership approach is more likely to yield a positive result. And this is a really, really important decision because it influences everything from contracting to payments to liability to reporting lines, and ultimately the overall delivery of your tender project. So first of all, then, a joint venture. This is probably the most complicated approach that you can take, and it involves setting up an entity designed for the purpose of delivering the tender itself. This is really often very, very positive because you have a clear mandate as to what you're delivering. There's a lot of flexibility and freedom in how you go about doing that. and the joint ownership and liability that you then have across all of the different parties that are involved is mandated by the liabilities of that entity. You often get greater capacity as a result of this to deliver, and access to greater resource, which is kind of flexible as to what you want to do as part of that entity. The downsides to a JV are that it requires a lot of time to set up, and often there's a requirement, really, realistically, that a JV will be under development prior to the release of a tender, even. So in anticipation of this coming up. We also sometimes see challenges around the actual delivery. So they will be designed to be equally run, but there is always a danger that some partners who are bought in could underperform. And there could be a clash in some of the culture and the management styles that are bought from different bodies that have kind of invested in the setting up of this joint venture, which can be difficult to iron out, especially when you're having to move quickly in response to a tender. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the commitments and the liabilities can have knock-on effects to parent companies as well. So there'll be a lot of kind of legal wrangling and agreements set up initially, which can take time. So moving on then to the next one, which is the consortium setup. Consortium is probably something which everyone is familiar with. I said here they're easy-ish to form, and that's, I think, in comparison to a joint venture. Anyone who's been part of forming a consortium knows that actually they are pretty difficult to get off the ground, but they're easier to set up and to execute. That's largely because you will have a contract that all parties will sign flowing down from the tender, rather than having to set up a new entity in and of itself. They're great because each organization can have a defined role within that consortium, and that is all set up from the beginning, and so it's easier to kind of plan from that perspective. And then the good thing is that, again, it offers greater capacity and access to resource in the same way that the joint venture does, really. The downsides that we've seen when entering consortium is that there can often be a lack of leadership, and this usually flows down from when we've entered a consortium, we haven't given enough thought to who's in charge when we come to do it, and that can lead to issues further down the line. Communication across the members of the consortium really good to begin with, and then starts to kind of slip off the radar as things go. And then it's really important to ensure that you've got those clear communication mechanisms and channels set up from the outset. And then you could be potential for the shortfalls of others, which is outside of your control in a consortium, in a way that there's more control in a JV. You have less control in that consortium setup. And then finally, subcontracting. And I know that there may be some on the call who, in tendering, they're looking to bring subcontractors in to support, or you might be a subcontractor who wants to look at how you can get into a tender. There's kind of two ways of looking at this. I think it's always really, really important to understand, first of all, that as a subcontractor, or if you're looking to subcontract, that the terms and conditions of the contract flow down from the contract that will be there with the tender. So it's really important to agree all that up front as part of that subcontracting agreement. Subcontractors are great because you often get a lot of specialist skills that you don't have in a large organization. They have a very kind of razor defined role to deliver a single piece of work and do it really, really well. And they can work pretty much independently to that consortium, and so they can often deliver pretty quickly. Some of the downsides and challenges that we see are around reliability. And this is not to say that subcontractors are inherently unreliable by any means, but rather that for subcontractors, particularly smaller subcontractors, awarding bodies will have less knowledge about the capacity and the expertise of those smaller subcontractors than they do about larger organizations. And so they'll therefore be looking to seek greater reassurances about capacity. So if you're bringing in a subcontractor, do your due diligence, make sure that you're going to be able to really convey the capacity of the subcontractor. And if you are a subcontractor, be prepared to answer some questions that might flow from that. And have your certificates, like your ISO certificates and so on hand, ready to provide evidence of your capacity. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some of the broader considerations that you might expect to see in public sector tenders. And in fact, these have been taken from the recent Commonwealth Games opportunities that we've seen. And one of them is regional expertise, particularly where local government are the tendering body. So first of all, it's important to consider what regional means in the context of the tender. Commonwealth Games, for example, isn't just Birmingham specific, but it covers Greater Birmingham, Solihull, parts of the Black Country as well. And the same could be said for other regions outside of Birmingham, especially devolved powers. I think it's important to bear in mind that if you're locally based, it doesn't mean that you'll be assumed knowledgeable about the region that you're in. So whether you're from outside of Birmingham or based here, it's crucial to show your successes in the area, how you have or plan to engage with the region. And that's something that all partners need to bring to the proposal, not just the lead. It's an opportunity for you to show your institutional and organizational strengths, not just about how well one individual or one team has done within that institution. And it's important to recognize your gaps as well. So what sort of knowledge gaps or skills gaps are you missing? And who can you bring in to fill them? And, who are the kind of obvious players in the region who you might be missing from your team? Be really clear about how your expertise is relevant, how you'll use it to engage with the region. Especially focusing on some of the identified key stakeholders. It's not enough just to have regional knowledge, but you need to be able to demonstrate why that matters. And then finally, have a think about how you can link your work to complement regional strategies and agendas, things like the local industrial strategy and the strategies of the Greater Birmingham Solihull Local Enterprise Partnership, Combined Authority Growth Company, people like that. And building those in, it can be a really clear and straightforward way of demonstrating your knowledge of the region. Secondly is social value, and this is something that came up in the Commonwealth Games. And so it's really important to bear all of these in mind. And this is kind of that overarching element that I talked about earlier on, which normally you're expected to demonstrate how you will tie in with regional social values and boost those. And I think if you have a look at some of those on the right-hand side, those are the ones that were outlined in the Commonwealth Game tender that I worked on last year. So I think it's important to note that they're all verbs. They want to know specifically what it is that you're going to do, not just what you think is a good social value. So having some activities that are clearly outlined around this is really important. I think it's important to play to your strengths in this respect. So show what you already do. What activities have you already got underway, perhaps part of your CSR agenda that's benefiting the region, and how are you going to integrate those? It's also important to be balanced. Don't play social value bingo. You don't have to address everything, but focus on where you're currently meeting those social values and how you'll draw upon them. Consider the short and the long-term benefits, and yes, be ambitious, but also be realistic. Don't oversell yourself. And I think that it's important to bear in mind that the plans that you put forward as part of your tender response will form part of the contract that flow down. So be realistic about your goals and what you can and hope to achieve and bring to the region. And so another clear consideration is writing. And bid writing in itself is a bit of an art, and we don't have nearly enough time to go into everything in detail. But here are some key tips that I've picked up along the way, and hopefully will be helpful for anyone who doesn't have experience in writing a competitive bid. And I think the first thing is to make it easy for the assessor and put yourself in their minds, and remember that tone and aesthetics really matter. They've probably got a stack of 20 bids they've already looked through over here, another 20 to go, and yours is kind of in front of them on the desk. And so they will not necessarily want a great big wall of words, but something which is really well structured and easy to follow, narrative, and something that is just a pleasure for them to read. And I think one of the key things here as well, which can help, is to actually look for advice from people within your organization or contacts that you have who work as procurement professionals, and ask them for their advice when they've been on the other side of the fence and reviewing a tender that's come in, what's good and what just wants to make them tear it up and throw it in the bin. They could be a fantastic resource of expertise. Some of the considerations would be the narrative elements. It's really important to get to the point. Don't be vague. Use compelling statements to demonstrate all of your strengths and expertise. Your word count is going to be your biggest enemy in this. So do be economical with your narrative. It's important not to cross-reference as well, or to minimize cross-referencing across different sections. Making concise standalone cases tends to be much easier for a reviewer to follow. Otherwise, it ends up a bit like a choose your own adventure novel, where you're having to kind of dip back and forth across different parts of the tender. There is some value in mimicking the language of the tender documents, so it's easier to assess and to clearly demonstrate which point you're addressing, but don't copy it word for word. And secondly is the methodology and your approach to kind of delivering the services. So demonstrate what stands out about your delivery. Where's your originality, innovation, your creativity, but also, again, feasibility is key. Make sure that it's believable that you'll be able to deliver this within the timescales and the budget constraints that you're going to have in place. And even if they're not asked for, milestones can be a fantastic way of demonstrating the thought that you've put in to ensuring that your approach is feasible. So they can provide that reassurance up front to the tender panel that you've not only thought about the program, but also how you're going to govern and evaluate your position as the project progresses. And then pricing, obviously super important. Normally pricing in public sector tenders will be the highest weighted section. Often upwards of 40 to 50% of the marks will be determined by your price. It's important to think about what type of price, what type of budget is being asked for. So is it a first time and final offer, or is it indicated that there'll be negotiation stages to follow, and your pricing strategy will be contingent on that. It's really difficult to get it right. It can be a bit of a minefield in terms of knowing how to pitch your pricing, and it's likely that you're going to need to do a lot of iterations of that budget, especially if you're working with a consortium or a JV. So make sure that you bear in mind the time that's going to be needed to bring that budget together and start early. Important to bear in mind those third-party costs there, as I said. It's really important before you submit the tender to reread two things. Firstly, the brief. Again, have a look at those mandatory travel items, deliverables that you're going to be asked for, and are they in your bid? Are they in your budget? Have you included them? But also read back through your bid and make sure that everything that you've said you're going to do has been costed in. It sounds really, really obvious, and it is really, really obvious, but once you get to that point, it's often a case that you've been working on this for months, and there've been so many meetings and different kind of things that have been thrown in from every different direction. It's really easy to miss some things that are there. So that final check can be an absolute lifesaver. And also bear in mind that budgets, because they account for that weighting, you're probably going to be asked for some clarification from the funders at some point. They might look to do a redlining process, even on a first and final offer. So it's worthwhile making sure you've got a breakdown on hand that you can look at when it comes to that stage. So I'm going to give a quick case study just to round it off, to give an example of a tender that we took part in recently, and some of the things that we learned by applying some of the things that we've talked about here. So this was a DFID opportunity. It was a multi-million-pound framework based on select topic expertise, things like conflict and environmental resilience and so on. And we played a specific role in every single lot of this tender. But we weren't the lead. We were working across 20 lots with lots of different people. So it was a hugely complex process. We had to demonstrate our institutional and individual expertise. And we know that we would not have been successful had we pitched this as an individual entity. In the end, all of the lots were successful, which is still a kind of a surprise to us, but we look at it as a great achievement and something that we learned a lot from. So as I say, that we partnered with various different consultancy, research institutes, and so on in delivering this. Some of the things that we learned, some of the positives that we learned through doing this, again, while we were preparing this, time was pretty crushing, to be honest. It was a framework, it wasn't directed, and we had to gather a lot of information from a lot of different people across lots of different organizations. And so I think the average was 6 drafts for all of the lots that we were putting in on. So we knew that this was going to be a requirement, and we built in a lot of time up front for this, and it really, really helped us when it came to getting a compelling bid together at the end. So I'll reiterate again, bear in mind the time constraints you're going to be up against. Also, we were wise to some of the cutoffs and time limits that we tend to see with public sector tenders. So in the terms of reference and the budget guidelines and so on, there were some cut-off points before the deadline as to when you could ask questions. We found that there was a kind of core ambiguity around intellectual property in one of the lots. We got in just before that deadline to ask the question, but we know that there were questions that came in afterwards from other applicants that they weren't able to answer. So yeah, it's always worth bearing that in mind, and we did, and we were glad that we did. And then finally, there were some downsides that we had from this, and one of them was that we lost a critical partner after the tender went in and the award came through. They dropped out, and they were absolutely key because they were leading one of the lots. The good thing was that we managed to retain that lot because we had built in a risk assessment and a contingency plan that covered that off. What would happen if somebody dropped out, and how would we mitigate it? And so we then worked with the wider group to find a new party. We planned overlap so different partners could expand their work streams to incorporate other areas of the work. And we worked with the funder to rejig some of the timescales, and DFID were great with that. But there's value in planning. Having that contingency in place was critical. Another one of the issues that we ran into when we started, though, was around the actual project management. So we found that one of the lead organizations hadn't designated responsibility for what would happen between the award and the actual start date. So there was no project manager role, and they really struggled to coordinate some of that activity without one. So it's important to plan your resources and that communication plan up front, and something that for future tenders we'll be taking into account in much greater care. So that was kind of some of our key learnings on that one. And so there we go. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. If there's any questions, then absolutely raring to go on those. And I'm just going to scoot back to the beginning so that if anyone does need to drop out, there's my email address, and do drop me a line if you've got any further questions about public sector tendering.
Thanks, James. That was really insightful and such a lot there to cover in about half an hour. So I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions once everyone has digested the information that you've just imparted with us, because I know for sure I will be re-watching the YouTube video to get the detail that you've just covered there. But really great, James, that you've gone from the basics as well, and just thinking about all the reading that is required and all the preparation that is needed to go into this to make sure that you give it the best shot to go for these tenders, would you say?
Sorry, you say it again.
No worries. The preparation that's required to, before you submit these tenders, the amount of reading that's involved, make sure that you give it the best shot possible, do all that you can. And just looking at, the considerations, who in your team is suitable to actually put the bid together. Have you engaged with everybody that you need to engage with? And so what would your, the case study as well that you've just said, I mean, that was a great experience, what you've said are the pitfalls that you fell into, but it was about mitigating for any eventuality, I suppose, and just ensuring that you're covering it all off.
Yeah, definitely. You can't underestimate the importance of really kind of digging into all of the tender documents that come out. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that it's an enjoyable experience reading through them, because it's not. But the level of kind of insight that you'll gather from reading through those tender documents is imperative. And you mentioned as well, the expertise that you need across the team, and I think that's really important. Getting different people from different areas and different backgrounds and areas of expertise to read through with you and to kind of give their view and their advice is imperative. Often the trap that we see organisations fall into is that they leave everything to somebody who is a tender professional, tender manager, to compile, to actually do the tender itself. Which is, coming from that background myself, I think it's imperative that you have people who are good at that sort of thing to be able to be competitive in this. But actually, the broader expertise that you have from a tendering team is going to be more important, and that person who's a tender manager will be there to collate that information and know how to convey that in the most compelling way to the funder.
I think as well, James, just looking at the piece that you did on social values as well, and making sure, I suppose what resonated with me is maybe less is more, and not trying to cover everything, but cover what you know that you're going to be really good at, so it's really good quality, and not feel that you've got to throw everything at it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's far more compelling to be authentic, because the flip side is that you risk appearing tokenistic, and some of the things that we tend to see appearing much more in tenders today are around equality and diversity, the inclusion of people from BAME backgrounds, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and so on. As well as kind of some of the broader social value slides that I included in there. And these are really important topics, and they're topics that will be very emotive to a lot of people who are involved in the tendering process. And it will show if you're not authentic in the way that you're looking to address those. So again, it can be really key to think about if there's something that you consider to be super important to your success, but you're not confident that you're able to deliver that. who can and can you bring them into the consortium?
Thanks, James. And we've got a question come through now from another James Trotter. Is it important to understand the client's values and objectives and make those reflected in your responses?
Yeah, definitely. So I think with any kind of tendering requirement, with the public sector, it's usually a little bit more straightforward because they will often actually stipulate what those values are and say, how are you going to achieve these and address these and factor these in? But if they don't, then I would always encourage you to do some background research on the organisation and figure out what is it that drives them. What's important to them. But again, to do that in a way that is authentic and it actually enhances the bid itself without making it look like you just copied and pasted from their CSR webpage, but it's going to resonate more with the people who are marking the tender if it aligns with what they think is important.
I think it's a little bit as well on what you said about, be careful what you put in because it could also form part of the contract in the end if you do win the tender. So you've got to be very realistic about what you can achieve.
Yeah, definitely. The actual tender response itself will be annexed onto the contract. So they won't take bits from the tender. They'll just say Appendix 1 is the tender response, and this is what it will be delivered. And often that what we tend to see a lot more now with public sector tenders is that they'll say how many interventions will you have, how many stakeholders will benefit from this, and how will you evidence that? And then when you come to the delivery phase and you have to evidence that, if you don't meet those quotas, then they might withhold payment. So it's really important to give a lot of thought to how you structure those deliverables.
Yeah, it's very important that what you put in is realistic and honest. So yeah, lovely. Thank you. Okay, well, we are just coming to a close now. It's 12:45. I mean, what a fantastic subject, and I can feel some follow-ups and follow-ons coming from this for sure. So we will be sending out the slides. Have you got anything final to add, James, before we leave?
I've just seen coming from Phil Pearson, which I can probably answer pretty quickly about how to go about finding tenderers who require specialist sub-consultants. I think there are a number of different ways. Coming at it from my perspective, if I was looking for a subcontractor, I would first of all think about who do I know who's in my network. And so it's really important, I find, to get out there and get to conferences, trade events, and to meet people and talk to them about what you do. Also to go to those funder-led events as well. When that tender comes out, go to one of those events and start, networking with people, handing out your cards, talking about what it is that you would like to do on a tender. But thirdly, also use some of those mechanisms that are available online to showcase your business. And especially if you've got experience in having taken part in tenders, how can you build that in to your online presence in order to make yourself look good for those consortium leads?
Excellent. And some of those events may, of course, be virtual at the moment. So many people on this call today have made the first step of attending the virtual procurement type of seminars. Get networking, get onto the Chamber website and see what events we've got coming up and get involved. So thank you very much, James. It's been brilliant. And thanks everybody for attending this afternoon. Have a great afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.